What's going on, everybody, and welcome back once again. My name is Jordan, also known as JMonster, and I want to thank you guys for joining me for another faction overview video. With the release of patch 0.97, the game has changed in far too many ways to count. We've added some new factions, and I don't think there's a single faction that's remained unchanged in at least one serious way, be it roster, be it mechanics, etc., etc. So, that being said, I want to take a look at some of the new factions. We're going to be starting with Numenor, and this video is very much intended to be a companion video to a fine guide that was created by Commander. I'm going to put a link for that down in the description. And it goes over a lot of Numenor's strengths and weaknesses. There were a few things that were left out, so we're going to cover those, and specifically some of the, can I classify them as mechanics? Well, in any case, you'll see and you can decide for yourself. But we're also going to look at some compositions that can be built that really play to Numenor's strengths. So without any further ado, let's dive in. So as mentioned in Commander's video, the roster for Numenor is fairly small. That being said, they have all of the tools that they need to be a successful and potent force on the battlefield, but you do need to have a clear goal, I would say, in mind. Perhaps more so than some other factions in the game, where you can fudge things a little bit. Angmar is a pretty difficult faction, for example, to make a bad composition with, but Numenor doesn't have a ton of units, and a lot of them are fairly expensive. They skip right over the whole low tier thing, and they go right to the mid tiers. So we have the Belgier Footmen here, which are, I would say they are a staple of the Numenor army in a lot of different ways. So you can use the Belgier Footmen to form a front line, and you can mix them up with some of the Belgier Pikemen, and it makes a fairly cost-efficient front line that you can use as the centerpiece of your army, and then you can support it with some of the stronger units that Numenor has available to them. So the Abari, pretty damn strong. A really strong heavy infantry pick, especially when you upgrade them. One thing to note is that, like armor upgrades, attack upgrades also give you 2 attack. So instead of 14, it's going to be 15, which is very, very high. That's as high as the Royal Legion of Armenalos, just to kind of put that into perspective. So really, really strong, very, very deadly, but they are quite vulnerable to armor-piercing missiles, and that's kind of a perennial weakness, I would say, of Numenor. So you need to have your quality mixed in with your quantity. Quantity is going to help soak up some of the damage, hopefully draw a little bit of attention and pressure away from your more valuable units. Let's drop one of the Belgier Pikemen, and let's add a unit of the Numenor Royal Guard. They make an excellent centerpiece. Plop them right down in the middle of your formation, and it's going to help stiffen the Belgier units, because the Belgier units, unlike the Numenorians, don't have the greatest morale. Most of the Numenorians are either 16 morale for a base, and many of them are also locked morale as well. And the Numenor Royal Guard happen to be one of those units that are locked. And as you can see here on their tooltip, they also give +2 morale to units nearby. So very, very helpful. Can help stiffen the Belgier Footmen, bring them up to 14, which is a pretty decent morale score, just below a lot of the Elven units, and altogether it just makes them a much more cohesive fighting force, and they're less likely to run away when somebody farts in their direction. From here on out, you're going to move on to your skirmishing units, and this is kind of going to dictate the way that you play. So if you wanted to do something a little bit more defensive, let's say you're in a siege, and then the Belgier Archers might be something that you want to bring. I recommend giving them an armor upgrade, because it just makes them extra tanky. 5 armor plus the 4 shield. They will probably not outshoot other units, but they will certainly outlast many of them. So that's something to bear in mind when picking these units, is that they are extremely tanky. So in this case, I don't want to do a whole lot of skirmishing. I want to bring myself some Seafarers and Nindamos, so I'm going to give them extra attack upgrades. That's going to bring them up to 10 damage, which is quite formidable. And for now, we're going to give them 2, and then we'll see kind of where we end up. The Romena Bawabarim are armor-piercing archers, which I know gives many people pause, because we've experimented with that in Reforged in the past, and it really didn't work out well. It created some pretty serious imbalances, and we had to rectify that in a following overhaul. So that being said, these guys are much more reasonable. You can't quite, so they've got about 5 ammunition. You will get 5 volleys out of each of them for a grand total of 10 volleys in total. They fire a similar amount of arrows to other armor-piercing archers in the game. In fact, I think they fire a little bit more, but their accuracy is nowhere near the same. That being said, there is something that sets the Bawabarim apart from other armor-piercing archers in the game. Aside from the volume of fire, because that's kind of obvious, but they have a special effect that deals morale damage to anything that they hit. So a -2 debuff, so enough to reverse your standard morale effect, which is +2 and 25 meters, and it will help you scatter your more numerous foes, which can be a real boon when you're playing as Numenor. If you can get the Bawabarim into a good position, it can help you cause some pretty serious routing, which can only play in your favor. Numenor is quite vulnerable to swarm tactics, and so they need to take the initiative, and they need to be aggressive, and they need to try and scatter their enemies with their superior firepower and their superior discipline. So these two units here, the Seafarers of Nindamos and the Romena Bawabarim, are pretty important for doing just that. While the Seafarers don't have a morale debuff that they apply, they can do a lot of damage. 10 missile damage is, on a javelin, javelins tend to cap out at about 8. But for these guys, it's a little bit higher, so whatever they decide to set their sights on, they will annihilate it if they can get their full ammunition off. So you need to make some hard choices when you're playing with these missile units. You need to prioritize, you need to quickly assess and identify threats, and then respond to them and try to neutralize them to the best of your ability. So that being said, I also want a couple of the Nardukadar. Oops, you know what I did? I brought the Narnar Royal Guard instead of the Pike unit. They look very similar. I mean, honestly, anyone can make that mistake. Even a developer. That's what I'm going to tell myself anyway. Hope you're not laughing at me too hard. That actually just saved us about 200 gold there too, which is really nice, because the Narnar Sentinels were only supposed to cost 1,000, whereas the other guys cost 1,200. But moving on from that, then we can move on to the cavalry. So previously, Numenor had a couple units of elite cavalry, and then they had like a Numenorean lancer unit. So instead of having the melee knights that they had previously, we've kept the Eldolande nobles, though they're now called the Farazim nobles, as they share a model with the Farazim swordmaster, so that's just consistency. One sec, guys. Not terribly embarrassing. I always have my Discord on, just because I like to stay in touch with all the things that are going on, the happenings and comings and goings. Anyway, so their elite 2 HP cavalry has been, for the most part, removed, and they no longer have the Numenorean lancers. But we wanted to keep the idea of elite warriors, the kind of upper crust of Numenor's ground forces, that they would have horses, that they would recognize the value of horses, even if they can't field them in the same numbers as many other factions in the game, such as Gondor, Rohan, Khand, etc., etc. So with that in mind, there's a couple ways that we've gone about representing that. The Romena Karibarim are a mid-tier lancer in terms of their charge, but they are a high-tier melee cavalry. They've got great armor, really good skill, and a decent shield value of 7. Their charge is armor piercing, and they've got about +5, I believe, against other cavalry. So they are potent, but they are very expensive, and there's not many of them. Most cavalry has been knocked down to about 60 size, with the exception of Khandish and Rohirric cavalry units, which are far larger. But for the most part, everyone tends to fall between 50 and 60. 60 is the standard size, 50 is the elite cavalry size. Very useful for defending a Numenorian front line. I tend to use them a little bit more reactively rather than aggressively, because once they're gone, and all the money that you dumped into them is gone with them. So you want to try and keep them together with the rest of the army, and make everything work together as a cohesive fighting force that is able to support each other instead of fighting in isolation, because doing that will definitely lead you to destruction as Numenor. So in this particular build, we could go for a third unit here of the Farazim nobles. I'm going to go for some Nardukadar, because they're really, really nice. And they're armor-piercing spearmen, good skill, good armor, etc., etc. So we're going to do that, and we're going to give them some attack upgrades in addition. And from here on, we kind of have to choose a general's bodyguard. I don't want to make it a frontline unit, So you want to, and you also want to give it something that doesn't have like a spear wall formation, because that will override the rally ability. So in this case, I'd give it to my Romena Abarim, just because they are going to be sitting in reserve for this army, and they're not going to be necessarily on the front line immediately, and yeah, it's just a good way of keeping them safe. So from here, we're going to increase the defensive capabilities of our army. Give some attack here to our pike units, which is nice for them. Although, I would probably give it to the Rumena Marksman. That's what these used to be called, the Wabarim. And that'll bring them up to 10 damage. So from there, I want to talk a little bit about deployments and the ways that you could potentially utilize this army on the battlefield. We'll talk a little bit more about tactics and things like that. And then we'll come back and we'll do a few more compositions. And then we'll say goodbye for the day. So I'll see you guys in just a moment. So please ignore the sprites. They're all weird black boxes. We are aware that that's a problem, and we are preparing a hotfix. Don't have an ETA on a release, but we are preparing a hotfix. So with this particular army on huge settings, obviously you're going to want to have your sentinels in the center. And hopefully we'll add some banners to Numenor as well, so you've got these big white blank canvases. You're going to have your elite pikes in the center. And when deploying like this, I've seen people do this, even veteran players do this, and it's a little detail, but make sure that your front line of your pikes is behind the front line of the spears. Otherwise, the pike units are just going to get shot immediately. It doesn't matter quite so much with the Narinari Sentinels, because they are equipped with their own shield, but for units like the Belgier pikes, you want to make sure that they're in behind at least one, perhaps even as much as two ranks of spearmen, so that they can protect the pikemen, who are far more vulnerable to arrow fire. So that's just a general little tip there. And you can usually accomplish this quickly by lining up basically the margins of your units and putting them just a couple ranks behind. So there, you can see, yeah, the first rank definitely is covering them, and there's some second units in behind, a second rank of units in behind them that will probably do that. Now, this is actually something that I thought everybody knew, and I'm not knocking if you didn't know this. I mean, everyone starts somewhere. But control groups. I've had a few people ask me how to keep armies in formation like this, instead of just having them devolve into a big ugly line. You're going to hit Control 1, or Control number, and that's going to assign those units to a control group, and they will stay in whatever shape you left them in last. If you're having troubles with the control group, just highlight the units, hit G, or Control 1, or whatever control group you want them to be in, and then reassign it to them quickly, and it should fix the issue. So from there on, we're going to have our Abarim in the center, or what are they called now? Yeah, Abarim, that's it. And we're going to add them to our control group, except for you. Get out of here. And the reason I do this is because, actually, a fun little deployment tip here. Your generals usually end up being put at the leftmost margin of a unit. So you can see this golden, beautiful bastard right here with his absurd Numenor Pope hat. You want to keep that general safe, obviously. And he's not going to be quite so safe on the left-hand side of your formation. Ideally, you're going to want him in the center. It's a good place where he's going to be able to support your armies and your troops, and especially the Belgier units. And he's going to be relatively safe from harm until something terrible happens to your front line. So there we go. We're going to put them down like that, and that way he's in the center of our army, not vulnerable to being clipped by a unit of cavalry, which is inevitably going to come around your flanks. So just another little thing to think about when deploying your army. And from there on, we're going to have our Romena Nardukadar. That's it. I know. You're probably thinking, JMonster, if you can't even pronounce these names, how do you expect us to? It's all part of the fun. It's part of the challenge of learning to play on patch.net 7 is learning how to pronounce the names. So, yeah, Yeah, it's not a bug, it's a feature, I swear. And then from there on, just slightly in behind them, because one other thing you want to keep in mind is that when people are shooting at your units, there's going to be arrows falling short. So you don't want them to be targeting multiple units at once, because that just lets their archers or whatever they're using be far more efficient than they would otherwise be. So try and space them such that things falling are not just gonna, clip units, like stray units here. But you also want to bear in mind that I think these units have about 180 range. So you want them to be close enough to your front line that they can still threaten other enemy skirmishers, even if you have to move them forwards ever so slightly. But you also want to try and keep your other units safe from harm if at all possible. And so from there on out, we have the Seafarers of Nindamos. And there's a couple ways you could use them. We could put them up here on our front line, and they could just toss javelins immediately as soon as you get to close to your enemies. And that's totally a viable tactic. Soften them up before they make it to your front line. But following up on what we mentioned earlier about priority targets and there being a little bit of spillover when people target them with ranged units like bows, is that you're obviously drawing a lot of fire onto your front line. And maybe that doesn't bother you, but for me, I personally don't want to do that in this setup, and I think there's some compelling reasons to do things a little bit differently. So, putting them back here, a little bit farther back, they're out of range of enemy skirmishers generally, and if they want to get within range, then they're going to come within range of your own bow units. And you don't necessarily want to use the Remena Boabarim in a skirmish fight, because it's kind of a waste. But if you had Belgier archers instead, then that would be something that you'd want to do. Second is that with the positioning that we have here, I can move my units like up and left inwards towards the center of the formation and up and right on the other side. But they don't have to move very far, and then you can use them to support your center. It's just one little quirk of kind of angles and positioning, is that even if units are not able to because there's intervening allied units, and units like crossbows sometimes won't fire over enemy units or over friendly units if there's a good chance of them hitting them. If you're on an angle like this, it's far easier to get to give line of sight to your missile units, and so they'll be able to just toss freely. So you can support your center very easily, but you can also support your wings as well. And one thing to note about javelin units is they do have a small bonus against cavalry. I think maybe the idea there by the original team who designed that bonus was that you could use the javelin to stab people, stab horses. You could use it as like a makeshift polearm. So, yeah, fair enough. But they do get a couple extra points of attack against cavalry, which can be useful. And they're also a threat that your enemy needs to deal with, and it draws attention away from your center as well, where I've placed my general. So that's just something to think about. And then from there on out, I would probably put these guys in a separate separate control group, just because I'm going to want to move them around a lot, and I want to be able to have easy access to them with just a keystroke. And it's not easy to do if you, or not as easy to do if you have just a single control group. So I usually start with most of my infantry in one control group, and then I'll break off parts of them according to kind of changing circumstances. In a stream earlier today, I broke off a combination of spears and halberds, and then I used them independently from my main infantry body to try and secure my wing, and I had them in their own control group that I just kind of made on the fly. So adapt, overcome, survive. In any case, so there's a little breakdown of your Numenorian army. Those are the kind of things. I mean, it seems like a lot, I feel, but those are the kinds of things that you want to think about, not only generally, but especially with Numenor, is that you need to think about those things, and positioning is going to be key, especially when it comes to getting the most out of your missile units, which, as I said, are really big equalizers for the Numenorian faction. So I think that's pretty good. The only other thing to really say is that this is an army that is obviously very at home in close quarters, so you're going to want to push forward and attack your enemies, but if you're walking into, I don't know, a Lindon pike wall, and they can support that with all kinds of javelins, obviously that's going to be a problem for you. One thing to note here is how your units decide to advance. You'll want to control that and make sure that everyone is is nice and safe and nice and protected. But yeah, what was I saying? Right, so you're not going to want to use this kind of composition in every single instance where you play the game. It's just, you just don't want to do that. That makes you like tactically inflexible. You're not really able to respond to changing threats and things like that. So I would use this against, this is the kind of army I'd probably use against the dwarves, for example. Could be very strong against them. You've got a lot of armor-piercing missiles that can be so useful. The dwarves don't have a ton of answers to things like this, and especially against Erebor, who's now got like chariots and they've got like a melee knight unit. The Cavalry? The Boabarim. The Boabarim can be extremely powerful. AP archers are a wonderful counter to heavy cavalry. They're just so destructive. Oh dear. Fight! Yeah, so I was doing a little bit too much talking here, and my pikemen ended up getting far ahead of my units, which is obviously not what you want to have do when you're attempting a rush the way that I'm doing here. But yeah, so you guys kind of get it. Let's take a look at another composition that's going to be created with fighting different enemies in mind. So one big change from 0.97 over 0.96.1 is that it is very viable to only have one or sometimes no cavalry in your armies at all. So we're going to make an army that's going to save us a little bit of extra money, about 700 or so extra florins in terms of our cavalry wing over the previous army that we made, and it's going to allow us to bring a little bit more heavy infantry. So this is an army that I would imagine would be quite strong when fighting against the elves, for example, where you can match them quality for quality. So in this case, I would bring a couple of pikes. Obviously, these are spears. Maybe we will give them damage, because they're not really there to do damage. So the Narrow... Nope. Made that mistake twice. Shame on me. The sentinels are there, and the pikemen are there. And we're going to give them a little bit of a boost. So we've got a smaller phalanx in the center, but still something that can match certain elven factions that do have pikes, man to man, or things that can pose problems to other elven factions that don't have pikes. So Mirkwood, for example, can sometimes struggle against a stubborn pike wall. But from there on out, we're going to bring the Royal Legion of Armetelos, and that's going to be our general's bodyguard today. We're also going to bring the Farazim Nobles, and we'll see if we can fit a Farazim Swordmaster unit in there, but we might just go heavier into our quality elsewhere. So we're going to bring 3 units of the Abarim this time. More than a match for a lot of elven heavy infantry. These guys pair up really, really well with the Mirkwood heavy infantry. Like, they are very strong. They can almost match them in skill. Although they do fall a little bit behind, but they've got similar or at least more damage, and their armor value is far higher. And some armor-piercing spearmen, which could be very useful for fighting against the elves of Imladris, for example. A couple seafarers, also nice to have. A couple Boabarim, which is also a good thing. We'll drop a couple. We'll drop the armor upgrades there. So we've got a bit of a choice here. We've got a lot of our big equalizers here that are great for doing shock damage against elven factions, which are traditionally quite low in number. Especially the Seafarers and Nindamos are very strong and very useful for doing that kind of thing. If we're playing, we can adjust this in a few ways. So if we're playing against Imladris, I think that the Boabarim are extremely important, especially if you're only bringing 1 cavalry, or perhaps you're bringing no cavalry at all, and you want to maybe bring something else. Maybe you want to bring an extra unit of Seafarers, and you're going to bring then another company of Belgier Footmen, and use them to try and like keep your backline safe and to zone out your enemies. Stuff like that. Maybe you want to bring some of the Royal Guard. Just give yourself a really strong elite bow unit. Where was I going with that? Right. So if you wanted to bring no cavalry, then you can economize, and you can you can compensate for that in different ways. So we can get rid of that and then bring ourselves a couple extra spearmen, which is going to help us defend our flanks and our back lines. We're going to have a ton of spears there, which is hard for any cavalry to deal with. And then we've got our armor-piercing missiles as well. So against Imladris, that's going to be particularly useful. If you're fighting against Lorien, I would maybe not worry so much about your ranged presence. Maybe bring yourself a couple of Belgier archers. Instead, just so that you have something that you can use to maybe pick on the lighter units, like the Wardens of the Gold, not the Wardens of the Gold Woods, it's like the March Wardens of the Wood or something like that. And then you've got 3 Seafarers of Nindamos that you can use in conjunction with your pikes, and you can support the Abadim and things like that. And then from there, like, you could drop, say, the armor on this pike unit, and then you could have your cake and eat it too. By bringing back the Farazim nobles, and then you can use them to kind of bully some of the Lothlorien cavalry and to keep their lancers out of your hair. But if we were going to fight, say, Imladris, and we wanted to meet them like quality for quality, we might do something a little bit different. I would certainly bring the Seafarers of Nindamos. I would bring the Sentinels. I would bring Pikemen. Imladris only has so many pikes, and you can make up for the quality disparity between the Belgier pikemen and the Imladris Sentinels somewhat by giving them armor and attack upgrades, and of course rallying around your Narnar Sentinels. You can actually make a phalanx out of these units entirely. So if you're going to take them on like full steam, mix the Seafarers in with the Narnar Sentinels and with the Belgier pikemen and other such units, and then you can bring your real quality. So if we're fighting Imladris, I'd probably want some Karabarim, maybe even Farazim nobles and a unit of Karabarim. I wouldn't even bother with missiles, because Imladris isn't going to invest heavily into that, and you're not going to do a ton of damage to them anyway. If you really want like an equalizer that's going to help you against the Gwythi Rockdoor, give yourself 1 unit of Romena Boabarim and make it their task to harass that 1 unit. And then from there, Royal Legion, maybe a couple of Barim, a couple Nardukadar. Or you could say no to the Ardukadar and get yourself a 3rd company of the Abarim. And then you've got some quality infantry that definitely stands toe-to-toe with whatever Imladris can bring. Then you can upgrade these units. And you've got a pretty solid army there. From there on, I would just try to give everybody as much attack as possible, because you're going to need something to break down the formidable defenses of the elves of Imladris. And this is going to bring us up a little bit short. We might not be able to spend all of our money, but if it's just 25, then that's not such a bad thing. Yeah, that's a pretty decent army there for fighting Imladris. So let's move on to something that's maybe a little bit more Mirkwood focused. So against Mirkwood, I'm anticipating, especially because they're new, that a lot of people are going to bring Ents. So think about that. Think about what they're going to bring. But I think it's fair to say that they're probably going to bring some Ents. But they're also going to have a lot of missile units as well. So you're going to need things that can stand up to punishment and arrows as well. So I think Royal Legion of Armenelos and Farazim Swordmasters are going to be instrumental. Belgier Footmen have the numbers, especially when you upgrade them, to stand toe-to-toe with some of the Elven infantry for a fair amount of time. So I would bring them there. I would also bring a unit of Narnar Sentinels. But you could do something totally crazy. A lot of our armies so far have had a phalanx, and they've been built around that. But you don't have to do that. Maybe bring yourself 1 unit of Narnar Sentinels that you can use to strategically put pressure on certain parts of the line of Mirkwood. But yeah, you don't necessarily need to have a phalanx in every army. It's totally viable to bring a Numenorian army and not utilize your phalanx, but you need to do so strategically, obviously. I would bring the Farazim nobles. I would maybe bring a 4th company here of Belgier spear units, just because we may drop that, but we'll see. But that's just because Mirkwood does have some decent cavalry. Their especially if you're not going to be bringing missiles. A lot of their cavalry is very, very weak to missiles, and their bodyguard is pretty decent. So you're going to need something to support your Farazim nobles. Again, you want to have things work together rather than in isolation. So from then on out, you have some choices. You could bring some shadow bows. Adonai shadow bows would be particularly powerful against the elves of Mirkwood, just because of their lower armor values. But if you don't want to bring them, maybe you want to bring a third company of the Seafarers and Nindamos, and you want to maybe use them as part of your front line or as your second wave. Well, let's see. Could drop this unit of spears here and then bring 2 of the Nardukadar. It's not a terrible idea. And what else? Got 600 to spend. Well, you could bring, if you're willing to drop an attack upgrade on, say, the nobles there. You could have your 4th company of spearmen. Oops. Or can you? We reached the limit? Apparently we have. Well then. Gives you 600. Well, I would honestly use that amount of money to do some crazy stuff. Not many people use chevrons, but when used strategically, they can be extremely valuable. I would give that to the Abarim. I would give attack to these units here. And there you are. You are going to be a little bit behind. I don't usually like to be that much behind, but we could drop this and maybe shift them over onto these units here. 160. Experiment a little bit. You might be able to give yourself some, like, supercharged Seafarers and Nindamos. There you go. So now they've got 11 damage. They're very unlikely to rout with that extra chevron. And you've got a small army, but one that is quite powerful and is definitely capable of defending itself against a heavy rush army with Ents. At least in my opinion. So you've got your nasty 2 HP elites here. You've got some pikes that Mirkwood can struggle to deal with, especially if you've used them well. You've got some numbers here. You've got like options for waves of attack. So let's take a look at how this might be deployed on the battlefield, and then we'll say goodbye for the day. So this can be where it's a little bit ticklish, because Mirkwood's got a lot of quality. So my personal intuition would be something like this. Set up a front line. You've got a barrier, something that's going to give you a little bit of time, something that with the addition of the Numenor Sentinels isn't going to go anywhere really, really quickly. And then from there, I would probably build my army in layers, essentially. Layers buy you time to assess the situation, and they also protect your units in behind the various barriers that you erect. So especially if you have skirmishers like the Seafarers and Nindamos, that can be particularly important, as it's going to give them time to do their work. Over here, we're going to have our Nardukadar on the wings, as that is where they need to be. Then you can have your Farazim nobles on whichever side you decide that they are most needed at. Over here in the center, actually, now that I think about it, if you think you're going to be fighting against Ents, maybe do something a little bit different. Put your pikes on a wing. Just because Ents can be really powerful against pikes, because they can just push right through them with their huge mass. But think a little bit about what your enemy might want to do to these units. So if we put this on our wing, this is basically setting ourselves up for an oblique to overwhelm the elves of Mirkwood, because they have no answers to pikes on that particular wing. That being said, if they recognize the threat that poses, then you can be ready for them. You can have a unit of your javelins waiting, and as soon as those Ents get in there, and start poking holes in your line, then you're able to counter them with some armor-piercing missile fire, which can be very, very powerful against them. That also being said, then we can move this unit, the Royal Legion of our Metallus, who give 3 morale and 50 meters to nearby units, and then you can move your Farazim Swordmasters over in that direction as well. So maybe you want to put your Farazim Swordmasters over here because you want to try and bait the Ents into coming to this side, because this is a threat that they can't answer, that the Ents themselves are uniquely suited to deal with. And then you can redeploy some of your missile units elsewhere, or you can have one of your missile units over here and hope that ends up working out. But in this case, I think that the Farazim Swordmasters they're more than capable of destroying the Ents in a really big way. And then that leaves us with a final unit here of the Seafarers and Indamos. And maybe we want to do something a little bit cheeky here and mix them in, perhaps on the other wing. So now that you've got a couple things here that your enemy needs to address. You've got threats on both wings. One of them is uniquely suited to fighting the Elves of Mirkwood, that being the pikes that you have there. And the other unit here is just a danger to Elven units in general. So the Ents can go for either direction, and you've got contingencies in place in the event that they do that, which is why I love layering my deployments the way that we've done here. The Elves of Mirkwood aren't going to have a ton of numbers either, and so they're not going to be able to necessarily overwhelm a smaller force like this. So it's okay to have a smaller army if you're fighting the Elves as Numenor, because you have the quality and you have the tools that you can use to exploit some of the weaknesses that the Elves tend to have, and that is that's really kind of localized, I think, in their Javelin units in this particular build. Because of how much damage they can do so quickly, especially with that 10 missile damage. Elves can't win a war of attrition. It will almost never work for them, except in very specific situations where maybe they're fighting other elves. And they don't necessarily have a ton of answers to these, right? So the Elves of Mirkwood can bring their own javelins, and those can be painful, but you have more javelins. They can't address all those threats at once. And if they're tossing their javelins at your javelins, then they're not using them to fight, or they're not using them here against your pikemen. Maybe they'll be focusing on your javelins with their javelins, and they'll throw their Ents at this side. Well, then you've got a plan in the event that happens. The Farazim Swordmasters can move forward very quickly. They're out of range of, hopefully at least of skirmishers, at least for a while, depending on how you position your army. And then you've got armor-piercing spears. You've got Farazim nobles that can support the spears and can be used to zone out enemies. And then you've got a really heavy-hitting infantry unit here in the center with incredible numbers. There's also 2 HP. So it's a pretty good army. There's a lot of moving parts to it, despite the fact that it is an infantry army. But I did want to show you something that went a bit lighter on cavalry and doesn't necessarily have a phalanx, because we had a bit of a general trend there, and I don't want you guys to get the impression that there's only one way to play Numenor, and that you can't be creative and experiment and still have that be successful and powerful. So here, let's just quickly move up here, and things like these 2 units here, the Seafarers and Indamos and the Belgian Footmen, it's easy to miss those, and people don't usually mix a javelin unit in on their front line. It's not something that I see people do, so you can really catch people off guard. So either they're going to get close enough that you can hit them with some javelins, like is about to happen to these guys here, which can be a bit of a surprise. Oh. Ooh, lag, And there you go. You got all of those units supporting each other. They're able to use like enfilading fire that can be so deadly. I mean, it's obviously one unit, but like you can kind of see this in action and why this can be difficult to address by anything that wants to approach this Numenorian army. So here we are, back at the title screen. That's gonna do for this video. We're gonna cut it off there. I think I showed you a fair amount of comps, and I showed you a little bit about deployment, and a lot of those are general tips that can be useful for playing as anybody, but with Numenor in particular, I think that thinking about those things beforehand can really help you be an unstoppable force on the battlefield. So yeah, with that being said, I hope that this was a useful companion video for you guys, and that you'll be able to use this in conjunction with the excellent work that Commander's done over his channel in breaking down Numenor and looking at all of their strengths and their weaknesses, and just helping you guys situate yourselves in the wide world of 0.97. There's so much that's changed, and there's obviously, there's going to be some improvement that we can make going forward, but 0.97 I think is really solid, and it's work that I think most of us are willing to stand behind, at least in terms of the multiplayer. Obviously the campaign still needs a lot of work, and we are working on some hotfixes for that to make it a little bit less crashy. But yeah, hope you guys have enjoyed this, and I'll see you later. Take care, everybody.